From time to time, I read an article that sort of provokes a thought and simply won't leave me alone. And that happened recently with Ryan Mohr's two-part article on making systems more approachable, which is a very nice article, and I'll include the links and encourage you to read it. And as I continued to think about it, surfaced previous thoughts. And one thought that comes up over and over and over again in lots of discussions is, why is it that systems thinking isn't more broadly adopted in the world? And my take on that is that systems thinkers spend hours, days, sometimes months developing relationship models to help them understand a certain aspect of something that they're curious about, or something that they would like to help other people understand. And they develop these relationship models, and in the process of developing them, they develop an understanding. And then they want to share that understanding with other people, so they send this relationship model to someone else who ponders it for a while and then typically sends back a comment like, well, that's nice. What they really wanted to say is, why the hell did you send this to me? Because the tendency is to send relationship models that are dead pieces of paper that look like this. Sometimes there's some amount of description that goes with it, though it's not a description that's sufficient to help one understand. Somewhere along the lines, I realized that a relationship model should actually tell a story. The way that you go to a play and you see the relationships between the actors unfold from one scene to another, and by the end of the play you sort of understand the story, and when you leave you take it with it. You take that understanding with you. Though with relationship models, the same kind of thing should happen, though what we typically do to people is equivalent to having the playwright walk up to someone and handing them the script for the play and giving them about 10 minutes and say, what do you think? There's just no possibility of them understanding it. The alternative is to develop a notation that's far less cryptic, easier for people to understand, and begin with what it is that you're trying to understand. It's not the system that we're trying to understand. It's a situation that we're trying to deal with. And you then ask yourself two questions. What is it that this influences and how? And what influences this and how? So if I begin with unwanted pregnancy, I understand that unwanted pregnancy has a tendency to create unwanted births, so that the change is in the same direction, so that if this increases, this increases. And I then say, okay, unwanted births has a tendency to do what? Well, it has a tendency to promote financial insecurity because, it costs money to raise children. And financial insecurity then has a tendency to promote or cause pregnancies to be unwanted because the finances aren't there to support it. So I've then created a loop, and we've learned that loops have far greater influence over the behavior of sets of relationships than simply direct influences, and loops come in two different types, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But I continue from here, and I ask myself, okay, so what else does unwanted pregnancy have a tendency to influence? Well, if it's unwanted, it has a tendency to influence abortion. And abortions have a tendency to diminish the number of unwanted births. So I've actually developed another loop that has a opposite relationship in it. Now, this is why we tend to use directionless noun or noun phrases as labels, because unwanted pregnancies send this in one direction, it causes it to increase, and abortion tends to send it in the other direction, so that it would be inappropriate to call it decreasing unwanted births or increasing unwanted births. And if we label the connections, it simply becomes more confusing, because if abortion increases, we shouldn't say diminishes unwanted births, because if it changes in the other direction, it has a different connotation. So we sort of learn to read based upon the colors. Though what's even more helpful is that as we develop these, there are two kinds of loops. There are reinforcing or growth loops and balancing or goal-seeking loops. And once we develop the loop, we label it to indicate what the loop is intending to achieve, and we sequence them, though we typically don't know how to sequence them until we finish developing all of the relevant relationships and understand how we want to unfold that story to someone else. So that here, the idea is that I've created this loop and I've identified it, but I can also provide a description of that loop itself so that someone understands, rather than try to figure out how to interpret the loop. They can read the description of the loop itself. And this second loop, which is a balancing or goal-seeking loop, also has a description that one can read. And balancing loops, you determine the difference between goal-seeking and balancing, or reinforcing and balancing loops, simply by counting the number of opposite relationships in the loop. If there is an odd number of relationships, then it's a balancing loop. If there's zero or an even number of them, it's a reinforcing loop. So you continue to do this, simply continue to ask the same question about what does this influence or what influences this, and until you think that you've identified all of the relevant relationships that help you understand what it was that you wanted to understand from the beginning. And you simply continue that, and you end up with something that looks like this. So you could send someone a diagram that looks like this with a short description, or you could send them a diagram that looks like this with a description and the ability to click on things and mouse over them and have it present what the description of that particular loop is. And Kumu is amazingly good at doing that, so that a person could simply walk through the pieces one at a time and understand what the story is. You could also unfold this in Kumu piece by piece by piece and describe it in a presentation format, or you can use the presentation format and do a video voiceover, sort of what I'm doing here, so that a person can simply watch the set of relationships unfold. And the whole idea is to be able to present the story to someone else so that they can understand the extent of your understanding at this point, and you offer it to them in the hopes that they will ask questions that you didn't think to ask, so that the model can actually get better and your understanding develops. So there's also a learning module called Storytelling with Kumu, which is available, which I now have to rework several sections of based upon this particular insight, understanding, whatever you want to call it. And I would encourage you to look at both the models that I've developed, because I have written more in the descriptions than I wanted to take time to put in this video, because it's already getting too long. So the link to all of the references are in the video, and hope you found this informative, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.